After my mother's death, I found a box with a diary in the basement of my house, and what I read in it shocked me. I was helping my dad clean out his garage last weekend. He's a pack rat, so this wasn't just an afternoon chore, it was a full-scale excavation. We were digging through boxes of old tools, broken appliances, and who knows what else when I came across an unmarked cardboard box tucked away in the far corner. It didn't look like much, but when I opened it, I found a bunch of random items, old photographs, letters, and a small leather-bound notebook. The notebook was what caught my attention. It didn't look like something my dad would own, it was too neat, too deliberate, and too personal. Curiosity got the better of me, so I flipped it open. The first few pages were harmless enough, doodles, random quotes, and some lists. But as I kept reading, I realized this wasn't just any notebook. It was a journal. And it wasn't my dad's. The entries were about my family. At first, they seemed innocuous, like someone keeping tabs on us for a story or a project. They noted little things: what time we left for work, how often we took out the trash, what my mom liked to plant in her garden. But the deeper I got, the more disturbing it became. The writer wasn't just observing us, they were obsessed. They wrote about arguments my parents had, times I came home late, and even private conversations I was sure no one else had heard. One entry, dated from about 15 years ago, stopped me cold. Her laugh is contagious. She'll be mine soon enough. She doesn't even realize how perfect she is for me. I knew they were talking about my mom. The last entry in the notebook was from the year my mom passed away. It said, "Time's running out. If I don't act soon, she'll never know how I feel. I'll make my move tomorrow. I have to." I didn't know what to do. I wanted to confront my dad immediately, but I hesitated. If this wasn't his notebook, how did it end up in his garage? And if it was his? When I finally worked up the courage to ask, he froze. He didn't try to deny it or brush me off. Instead, he simply said, "Where did you find that?" I told him, and his face went pale. He sat down, staring at the floor for what felt like forever before finally saying, "There are things you don't know about your mom. Things I didn't know until it was too late." He refused to say more, but his reaction only raised more questions. Who wrote that notebook? What did they mean by making their move? And most importantly, what did my dad know that he wasn't telling me? I'm not sure what to do next. Part of me wants to let it go, but another part of me needs answers. Was my mom in danger all those years? Or worse, was she already gone by the time I found that notebook? My dad's reaction to the notebook haunted me. The way his face drained of color, how his voice trembled when he asked where I'd found it, it wasn't just confusion. It was fear. A fear I'd never seen in him before. I couldn't let it go. That night, when the house was silent, I slipped back into the garage. The box was still there, but I combed through it again, desperate for any clue I might have missed. At first, it felt like a dead end. Old receipts, faded photos, and scraps of nothing meaningful, until I found it. Folded so tightly it was almost invisible, there was a piece of paper wedged in the seam of the box. I unfolded it with shaking hands, the creases stiff and brittle. The handwriting stopped me cold. It matched the notebook. The letter wasn't addressed to my dad or me. It was for my mom. The words were intimate, obsessive, and threatening all at once. They spoke of love but carried an undercurrent of something much darker. "You don't see it yet, but we're meant to be. Tomorrow, I'll show you. If you don't understand, I'll make you see. I'm not giving up on us." The words lingered in my mind like an echo in a dark, empty room. Who would write this? And why had my dad hidden it? The next morning, I confronted him. The letter was in my pocket, crumpled and warm from my grip. I wasn't sure if I was angrier or more afraid, but I needed answers. When I mentioned the letter, my dad froze. For a moment, I thought he might deny everything, brush it off as nothing. But then he sighed, a deep, weary sound that carried years of burden, and sat down heavily. "You don't know the whole story," he muttered. His voice was quiet, almost as if he were speaking to himself. He told me about a man named Richard, a coworker of my mom's from years ago. Richard had been strange. At first, it was little things, standing too close, showing up unannounced. My mom had dismissed it, chalking it up to awkwardness. But it escalated. Letters in the mail. Gifts left on the porch. And then, one night, Richard had been outside our house, standing under her window, staring up at her like he belonged there. My dad had confronted him. There was shouting, threats exchanged, and eventually, Richard disappeared, for a while. But he came back. The night Richard broke into our house, my dad said, was the night everything changed. He didn't go into detail, but I didn't need him to. The way he spoke, the look in his eyes, it was clear he'd done something to ensure Richard wouldn't come back again. "What happened to him?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My dad didn't answer. He stood, walked to the fireplace, and threw the notebook and letter into the flames. The fire consumed them quickly, the edges curling and blackening until there was nothing left. "They can't hurt us anymore," he said, more to himself than to me. But I wasn't so sure. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the notebook, the letter, and the way my dad had avoided my question. If Richard was gone, then who had written the notebook? And why now? At some point in the night, I heard it, a faint sound, like footsteps on gravel. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I crept to the window and peeked through the curtains. In the dim light of the street lamp, I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of our yard, motionless. Watching. I couldn't make out a face, but I felt their eyes on me, sharp and unyielding. I blinked, and they were gone. Was it my imagination? A trick of the shadows? Or had Richard's story never truly ended? The morning after spotting the shadowy figure in the yard, unease clung to me like a second skin. My mind replayed the image over and over, twisting the details until I could no longer trust what I'd seen. Was it real, or had the fear from the notebook and letter pushed me into imagining things? As I stepped outside, trying to ground myself, my heart stopped. There, on the driveway, lay a single sheet of paper. It shouldn't have been there, not pristine and untouched like that. My hands shook as I picked it up. The handwriting was unmistakable, the same precise scrawl as the notebook. The message was chilling, urging me to continue searching but warning of the dangers of uncovering too much. The writer knew I was looking, knew I wouldn't stop. And they were waiting for me to find something, or for me to make a mistake. The realization sent a shiver down my spine. Someone had been there, standing just outside the house while I slept. Watching. Leaving this. I locked every door and window as I went back inside, panic clawing at my chest. My dad was in the kitchen, his calm demeanor a sharp contrast to the storm brewing in my mind. I couldn't hold back the flood of emotions as I threw the paper on the table. His reaction was immediate and telling. He didn't ask questions or try to dismiss it. Instead, he looked at the note as if he'd seen something like it before. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he led me to the basement. The room felt colder than usual, the smell of damp wood and mildew sharper now. He opened an old, locked cabinet I'd never noticed before. Inside were stacks of letters, dozens of them, all in the same handwriting as the notebook. Some were yellowed with age, others looked more recent, as if the writer had never truly gone away. The letters revealed a timeline of obsession that hadn't stopped with my mother's death. They had continued, sporadic but persistent, with enough frequency to remind my dad that whoever it was had never truly left. My dad's silence as I sifted through them said everything he wouldn't. He had hoped they'd stop. He had hoped they'd been nothing more than the fading remnants of a disturbed mind. But now, he couldn't deny they were escalating again. That night, I barely slept. My thoughts raced, and every sound seemed amplified in the stillness of the house. When I finally drifted into an uneasy half-sleep, something pulled me back, a noise, faint but unmistakable. I crept to the window, my breath catching as I saw the figure again. This time, they were closer, standing at the edge of the porch. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but their presence was undeniable. By morning, they were gone. The only trace of their visit was another note, left neatly on the porch. This one was different. It wasn't just a warning, it was a challenge. It mentioned my mother. Not just her life, but the night she had died. It urged me to ask questions I wasn't sure I wanted answers to. For years, I had accepted the version of events my dad had told me about her death. It had been sudden and tragic, a cruel twist of fate. But now, cracks were forming in that story, and I couldn't ignore them anymore. There was something my dad wasn't telling me. Something he'd buried along with her. And whoever was leaving these notes knew it. They wanted me to uncover it. The question wasn't just what happened to my mom. It was why someone had waited all this time to force the truth into the light. The note lingered in my hand long after I'd read it, its words clawing at the fragile wall I'd built around my memories of my mother. For years, I had accepted what my dad told me, that she had passed away quietly in her sleep, her heart simply giving out. But this note, with its veiled accusations and cryptic warnings, suggested a different truth, a darker one. The house felt suffocating, the walls pressing closer with every unanswered question. My dad was avoiding me now, retreating to his workshop or staring blankly at the television, as if distancing himself could erase what had already been set in motion. He wasn't going to tell me what happened. I would have to find the truth myself. I started with the attic. It had been years since I'd gone up there, but I remembered my mom keeping boxes of her personal things stored away. Dust blanketed everything, the air stale and thick, but the boxes were still there. Inside, I found the expected, photo albums, letters, trinkets from family vacations. But at the bottom of one box, wrapped in an old scarf, was something unexpected, a journal. My mother's journal. The entries were sporadic, her handwriting looping and elegant, but one section stood out. The tone shifted, her words turning cautious, even frightened. She wrote about someone watching her, a presence she couldn't shake. She didn't name them, but she described the same behaviors my dad had mentioned: gifts left on the porch, phone calls with no one on the other end, and a feeling of being followed. One entry stood out, written just a week before she died: "He's becoming bolder. I see him everywhere now, at the grocery store, outside the library, even across the street from the house." I told my dad's name, but he says I'm imagining things. I'm not. I can feel him watching. I don't know what to do anymore. The final entry was shorter, written the night before her death. She mentioned a confrontation, a heated argument she had overheard between my dad and someone at the door. She hadn't written who it was, but her words hinted at a sense of finality, as if she knew something was coming. The air felt heavier as I put the journal down. If my mom had known she was in danger, why hadn't anyone done anything? Why hadn't my dad told me about this? Back downstairs, I found him sitting at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. He looked up as I walked in, his eyes dark and tired. He didn't ask what I'd found. He already knew. I confronted him again, this time not with anger but with the weight of the journal in my hands. The mention of the argument seemed to break something in him. Slowly, painfully, he began to talk. There had been a man, Richard. My dad had confronted him several times, each encounter more hostile than the last. Richard's obsession with my mother had grown uncontrollable, and my dad admitted he had threatened him to stay away. The night before my mom's death, Richard had come to the house. There was a fight, one that spilled outside, where my dad claimed to have scared him off for good. But the timeline didn't add up. My mom had died the next night, alone in the house while my dad and I had been away at a family gathering. The coroner had ruled it natural causes, but now the cracks were impossible to ignore. Had Richard come back? My dad swore he hadn't seen him again after that night, but his guilt was palpable. He blamed himself for not being there, for not doing more to protect her. And now, with the notes appearing in someone watching the house, it felt like her death was catching up to him, and to me. That night, I stayed awake again, but this time I wasn't waiting in fear. I was waiting for a chance to confront whoever was out there, whoever was toying with us. At around 2 a.m. I heard it, the faint crunch of footsteps on gravel. I didn't move to the window. Instead, I crept to the front door and peered through the peephole. There they were. The figure. This time, they weren't just standing, they were moving toward the door. Toward me. My heart raced, but I didn't flinch. Whoever this was, they weren't going to hide in the shadows anymore. I waited until they were just a few feet away, then threw the door open. The figure froze, and for the first time, I saw their face. It wasn't Richard. It was someone I knew. Someone I trusted. The figure stood frozen under the porch light, caught in its sharp glow. My stomach sank as recognition dawned. It wasn't Richard. It was Eric, my dad's oldest friend. The man who had been at every family barbecue, who'd offered fatherly advice when I needed it, who had been a quiet presence in our lives for as long as I could remember. Eric's expression shifted from shock to calm, as if he'd quickly decided how to play this moment. His presence felt wrong, out of place, like a puzzle piece forced into a spot where it didn't belong. He stepped closer, his movements slow and measured. His voice, when it came, carried an unnerving ease, like he wasn't surprised to be caught. He spoke of concern, of checking in, but his words betrayed an underlying tension. He hinted that I had been digging into things better left alone, his tone carrying the faintest edge of warning. The realization hit me like ice, the notes, the watching, it had been him. He didn't confirm it outright, but the weight of his silence told me enough. He knew more than he was letting on, and he wasn't here to put my mind at ease. I shut the door, locking it with trembling hands, unwilling to let him stay another second on the threshold of my home. From behind the door, I listened, my breath shallow and uneven, as his footsteps retreated into the night. The next morning, I confronted my dad with what had happened. When I told him about Eric's visit, his face fell, a mixture of exhaustion and despair settling into his features. He didn't react with surprise, only a resigned heaviness, as though he had been expecting this. Without a word, he led me to the basement. In the far corner, behind a pile of old boxes, he unlocked another container I'd never seen before. The contents felt like a confession in themselves: newspaper clippings about my mother's death, photos of her taken from strange angles, and a police report. The report detailed a witness statement from the night my mom died, describing a man seen leaving the house in a hurry. The description had been vague, and though suspicion had fallen on Richard, no evidence linked him to the scene. The case had been closed when the coroner ruled her death as natural causes, but my dad had kept these pieces, quietly harboring doubts. As I sifted through the contents, a new understanding began to take shape. Eric had always been close to my mom, always present but never intrusive enough to draw attention. The realization unsettled me. Had we missed something all those years? Had his closeness been a warning sign my dad had ignored? That night, I stayed awake, listening for the now familiar sound of footsteps in the stillness. When they came, they were louder, more deliberate. Peering through the window, I saw Eric again, but this time, he wasn't alone. Another man stood with him, someone unfamiliar, yet his presence felt just as calculated. When the knock came, I opened the door cautiously, my pulse hammering in my ears. The man stepped forward, his gaze steady and unyielding. His words were slow, deliberate, and heavy with implication. The truth, he said, wasn't about who had killed my mom, it was about why. The weight of his statement crushed the fragile understanding I'd been clinging to. The story I thought I knew was unraveling before me, revealing a darker, more complicated reality than I could have imagined. The man standing with Eric had a presence that filled the space around him, his steady gaze locking on mine as if he already knew what I was about to ask. The words he had spoken, about the why, not the who, hung in the air like a fog, heavy and suffocating. Eric stood silently, his posture unusually rigid, a stark contrast to the easygoing demeanor I had grown up knowing. It was as if the man beside him carried the weight of something Eric couldn't bear to carry alone. The man didn't wait for me to speak. He began piecing together fragments of a story, weaving details that felt as if they had been pulled from the shadows of my childhood. He spoke of obsession, of a connection to my mother that had gone deeper than anyone had realized. Not Richard's fixation, this was something more insidious, something that had roots within my family. Eric's involvement became clearer with every word, his role shifting from a bystander to something far darker. He had been there, not just on the periphery, but deeply entangled in the events that led to my mother's death. The man revealed that my mother's death had not been the result of natural causes. Instead, it had been a carefully orchestrated cover-up. The coroner's ruling, the police investigation, both manipulated, their outcomes shaped by someone with influence. Someone close enough to make sure no one looked too deeply. Eric's head dropped, the weight of guilt pulling him down. He hadn't killed my mother, but he had known. Known what was happening to her, known the danger she was in, and chosen silence over action. My hands clenched at my sides as a wave of anger and betrayal washed over me. The man's revelations were too calculated to be lies, the precision of his details too exact to be coincidence. He hadn't come here to threaten me, he had come to force the truth into the light. But there was something deeper in his tone, an edge that hinted at unfinished business. He mentioned debts, promises broken, and consequences that were finally catching up. Eric, he explained, had been part of something larger, a plan that had spiraled out of control. It wasn't just about my mom. It was about my family. About me. The realization hit me like a tidal wave, pulling me under. My mother's death had been part of something I couldn't yet fully grasp, something that reached back further than the events of that night. And now, after all these years, it was surfacing, dragging Eric and my dad, and by extension, me, back into its grip. The man stepped back, his final words a warning more chilling than any threat. The truth, he said, was coming, whether I was ready for it or not. Eric turned to leave, his silence more telling than any apology. My dad, who had been watching from the shadows, stepped forward, his face lined with a grief that seemed deeper than I had ever seen. We both knew there was no escaping what was coming next. The past wasn't just resurfacing, it was consuming everything in its path. The door closed behind Eric and the stranger, leaving the house steeped in an oppressive silence. My dad stood at the base of the stairs, his face pale and drawn, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. He didn't speak, but the look in his eyes told me everything. He had known, maybe not all of it, but enough. I waited for him to say something, to explain, but he simply walked to the living room and sank into his chair like a man who had aged 10 years in a single night. He stared at the floor, his silence heavier than the stranger's words. The pieces of the story felt scattered in my mind, fragments of a larger picture I was still struggling to understand. Eric's involvement, the cover-up, the man's cryptic warning, it all pointed to a truth I wasn't sure I was prepared to face. But one thing was clear, my mother's death had been no accident. I returned to the basement, searching the box my dad had opened earlier. The police report and photos seemed to hold new weight now, their details sharper in light of what I had just learned. I flipped through the clippings, my fingers trembling as I traced the faded text of an article about her death. One detail caught my attention. It wasn't new, but it stood out now like a flashing sign, the timeline of her death. The article mentioned that she had been alone in the house for several hours before she was found, but the coroner's report had ruled her death as sudden. If it had been so sudden, why had she been alone for so long? The timeline didn't add up. And if the official story was a lie, then the truth had to be buried somewhere else. I decided to confront my dad again, but this time, I didn't approach him with anger. I sat down across from him, laying the police report and clippings on the table between us. The evidence spoke for itself. He finally broke his silence, his voice heavy with a mix of guilt and resignation. He admitted that he had suspected Eric for years but had never been able to prove anything. The night of her death, he had been away with me at a family gathering, and Eric had been the one who volunteered to check on her when she hadn't answered her phone. My dad's voice faltered as he recounted returning home to find her gone. The timeline, he said, had always bothered him, but Eric's alibi had seemed airtight. The police had dismissed his suspicions, chalking them up to grief. But the stranger's warning had cracked something open. My dad confessed that he had been receiving letters, much like the ones I had found, ever since her death. They had been vague, cryptic, but always hinting at something he hadn't known, something hidden in the shadows of that night. I pressed him about the stranger, about who he was and why he seemed to know so much. My dad hesitated, then admitted that the man was someone from Eric's past. Someone who had been there during those years, always on the edges of our lives. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house felt like a whisper of something unseen, every shadow reminder that someone was out there, waiting for me to uncover what they had been hiding. At 3 a.m., a sound broke the silence, a knock at the back door, soft but deliberate. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Grabbing the nearest heavy object, I crept to the door and peered through the curtain. There was no one there. But taped to the glass was another note, its edges fluttering slightly in the breeze. I tore it down and read it under the dim kitchen light. You're closer than you think. But you'll have to choose, how much are you willing to lose to know the truth? The words chilled me to my core. This wasn't just about my mother anymore. Whatever had happened, it had been woven into my family's fabric, a secret that had poisoned everything it touched. And now, I was left to unravel it, no matter the cost. The note on my windshield felt heavier than paper, its words pulling me into a storm I couldn't escape. My pulse raced as I reread it, my surroundings fading into the background. Whoever this person was, they weren't just taunting me, they were setting the stage for something bigger, something far more dangerous. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the street as I drove home. My grip on the steering wheel tightened with each passing mile. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, the faint glint of headlights in my rearview mirror hovering just a little too long. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the headlights were gone, but my paranoia had only grown stronger. I stepped out of the car, glancing around, my senses heightened. The neighborhood felt too quiet, as if it were holding its breath. Inside, I found my dad pacing the living room. He stopped when he saw me, his eyes flicking to the note I still clutched in my hand. He didn't need to ask, he already knew what it was. Before I could say anything, the sound of glass shattering cut through the air. We both froze, the noise coming from the back of the house. My dad moved toward the kitchen, but I grabbed his arm, motioning for him to stay back. Grabbing a heavy flashlight from the counter, I crept toward the broken window. The shards glittered on the floor, the cool night air seeping into the room. Outside, in the darkness, I thought I saw movement, a shadow slipping away into the trees. My breath caught as I stepped closer, peering into the night. A sudden thud behind me made me spin around, my heart leaping into my throat. My dad stood in the hallway, holding a crumpled piece of paper he'd picked up from the floor. Someone had thrown it through the window. I unfolded it with shaking hands. This note was different, its tone sharper, more urgent. Time's up. Meet me at the lake tonight. Come alone. If you want the truth, you'll do as I say. The lake. The one where my mom used to take me as a kid, where she always said she felt at peace. My stomach twisted. Whoever this was, they knew too much. My dad tried to stop me, his protests falling on deaf ears. I wasn't waiting anymore. If they wanted to meet, I would go. But I wasn't going unprepared. I grabbed a flashlight and a crowbar from the garage, the weight of the metal reassuring in my hands. The drive to the lake was silent, the tension in the air suffocating. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers against the night sky. When I arrived, the parking lot was empty, the moon casting an eerie glow over the water. I stepped out, my every sense on high alert. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves. A figure stepped out from the shadows, their silhouette barely visible. It was the man from before, the stranger who had come with Eric. He held up a hand, motioning for me to stop. But before he could speak, the sound of tires screeching pierced the air. Headlights flooded the area as a car barreled into view, its engine roaring. The figure dove to the side, shouting something I couldn't make out. The car skidded to a halt, and the door flew open. Eric stepped out, his face twisted in desperation. He yelled at the stranger, his words incoherent in the chaos. Then he turned to me, his voice cracking as he begged me to leave. Before I could react, the stranger lunged at Eric, tackling him to the ground. They struggled, their shouts echoing across the lake. The flashlight in my hand shook as I watched, frozen, unsure of what to do. Eric broke free, scrambling to his feet. His eyes locked on mine, a mix of fear and guilt flashing across his face. He started to say something, but the stranger pulled a knife, the blade glinting in the moonlight. The world seemed to slow as the knife swung toward Eric. Without thinking, I ran forward, the crowbar heavy in my grip. The sound of metal meeting flesh was sickening, but the stranger dropped the knife, stumbling back with a grunt. Eric collapsed to his knees, clutching his chest, his breaths ragged. The stranger glared at me, blood dripping from a gash on his arm. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice low and venomous. Then he disappeared into the trees, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding, my hands trembling. Eric tried to speak, his words barely audible. He said something about the truth, about the night my mom died, but his voice faded as he slumped to the ground. The truth had almost killed us both, and now it was clear, this wasn't just about my mother anymore. It was about a web of lies, obsession, and betrayal that had been building for years. And I was caught right in the center of it. The moments after Eric collapsed felt like hours. The stranger had disappeared into the trees, his threats hanging in the cold night air. My mind raced as I knelt beside Eric, his breath shallow, his eyes fluttering with the weight of what he was about to say. He whispered something faint, fragmented words about that night, about my mom, about my dad. I leaned closer, desperate to make sense of it, but his voice faltered, and he fell silent. I grabbed my phone and called for an ambulance, the trembling in my hands making it hard to press the buttons. The wait felt endless, each second filled with the deafening roar of my thoughts. When the paramedics finally arrived, they whisked Eric away, leaving me standing alone by the lake. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, staring out at the rippling water. Eric's words replayed in my mind, fragmented but damning. He had known something that could change everything, about my mother, about my family, but now he was barely clinging to life. When I returned home, my dad was waiting in the living room. He took one look at me, at the blood on my hands and the exhaustion on my face, and he knew. I confronted him, pushing harder than ever, laying out every detail Eric had revealed before collapsing. My dad's expression shifted from resignation to something deeper, fear, but also guilt. He admitted that he had known about Eric's obsession with my mom, but what came next stunned me. He confessed that he had made a deal with the stranger, an agreement to keep Eric's obsession hidden in exchange for keeping the family safe. My dad had thought it was over after my mom's death, but the notes, the surveillance, the threats, they had never truly stopped. The stranger was tied to Eric's past in ways my dad had never fully understood. They were part of something larger, something my dad had been too afraid to confront. And now, after all these years, the truth was clawing its way to the surface, bringing all of us down with it. The next day, I got a call from the hospital. Eric had regained consciousness, but his condition was critical. He wanted to see me, his voice strained as he requested my presence. When I arrived, his face was pale, his breathing labored. He didn't waste time. With the little strength he had, he recounted the truth he had been running from for years. The night my mom died, Eric had gone to her house to confess his feelings. She had rejected him, gently but firmly. But the stranger, the man who had been watching us, was there too. He had followed Eric, waiting for the right moment. The stranger wasn't just an observer, he had been an enabler, pushing Eric's obsession, feeding his delusions. When my mom rejected Eric, the stranger took it further. He wanted control, wanted to punish her for not falling into line. Eric admitted he had left the house after an argument, but the stranger had stayed behind. Eric hadn't killed my mother. The stranger had. But Eric had kept quiet, too afraid to expose the truth. The stranger had blackmailed him, threatening to reveal Eric's obsession and destroy what little dignity he had left. And so, for years, Eric had lived with the guilt, burying the truth until it finally came crashing down. As Eric's voice faded, his final words hit me like a hammer. The stranger wasn't just anyone, he was someone tied to my father. Someone who had been close enough to the family to manipulate everything. The pieces fell into place. The stranger's cryptic notes, his deep knowledge of our lives, it all pointed back to him. When I returned home, I confronted my dad one last time. He didn't deny it. The stranger had been his brother, my uncle. A man estranged from the family years before, someone my dad had tried to shield us from. My dad had known he was dangerous, but he had never imagined the extent of his obsession. My uncle had orchestrated everything. He had fed Eric's fixation, used him as a pawn, and ultimately taken my mother's life when she became an obstacle. And then, he had watched us for years, feeding off our fear and grief, until I had unknowingly forced him out of the shadows. The police arrested my uncle days later, using the evidence I had gathered, including Eric's testimony. My dad, broken by the weight of his secrets, withdrew into himself, a shadow of the man I had once known. As for me, I stood by the lake one final time, staring out at the water where it all began. The truth had come at a cost, tearing apart the fragile threads of my family. But for the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of peace. The past was no longer haunting us. It had finally been laid bare, leaving nothing but the quiet ripples of the truth behind.